Hello again. In this screencast, we're going to follow up on some issues related to the Cold War and show you how it ultimately concluded, at least in Europe. However, we're going to start first not in Europe, but in Cuba, where in 1959, Fidel Castro, shown here in the lower left of your screen, successfully led a revolution in Cuba against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. It wasn't clear immediately where Castro was going to take Cuba following the revolution, and within a year he'd formed an alliance with the Soviet Union. You see him there holding Nikita Khrushchev in the picture in the lower left-hand corner. Needless to say, this didn't sit too well with the United States, now having a communist state less than 100 miles from U.S. soil, as you see by the map in the upper left-hand corner. As part of our policy of containment, we actually had to work close to home, where in 1961, President Kennedy authorized what became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, where anti-Castro forces that had been trained and supplied by our CIA landed in an attempt to take over the Castro government. Unfortunately, it was not a well-planned or executed operation, went badly, and ultimately made the United States look weak. And it also painted Kennedy, at least for a while, as somebody who couldn't stand up to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. More on that in a little bit. 1961 was also not a good year in Europe, especially in the city of Berlin. You may remember that Berlin had been divided into eastern and western sectors after the airlift of 1948. And in 1961, the Soviets decided to completely cut off West Berlin from East Berlin by the construction of the Berlin Wall, which you saw in the video Brave New World. Between 1950 and 1960, over 3.5 million East Germans had left for the West, moving from the eastern sector into the western sector of Berlin as a stepping stone to get to Western Europe and the NATO allies. East Germany referred to the Berlin Wall as the anti-fascist barrier. However, it's pretty clear that the wall wasn't built to keep the West out, but to keep the East in. As you see in the lower left-hand corner, anti-tank trenches, concrete blocks, beds of nails, and of course barbed wire were all part of the Berlin Wall and all part of the barricade. The picture here in the lower right-hand corner shows an East German soldier risking his life to jump across the barbed wire barrier and defect to the West. It became an iconic picture in Life magazine. Ask your parents, definitely your grandparents, they can tell you. Back to Cuba again. In October of 1962, American spy planes flying over Cuba took pictures of what were apparently missile bases being built in Cuba. As you can see from the maps and the photographs, this would put nuclear missiles less than 100 miles from American soil. This was not something that was acceptable at all to the Americans. And Kennedy was faced with a rather difficult decision. He could parachute troops into Cuba and take the bases. However, that would be risking an escalation of war with the Soviet Union. Likewise, an airstrike against the bases would have done the same thing. Ultimately, after 2 weeks of tension, Kennedy took what may have been the safest but also one of the riskiest approaches at the same time. The missiles had not been equipped with nuclear warheads. Those were being carried by the Russian Navy to Cuba. Kennedy chose to try to intercept those ships in the middle of the ocean in hopes that the Soviets would back down and turn around and ultimately not arm the missiles. It was a tremendous bluff and a tremendous gamble. Fortunately, it happened, and the Soviets did turn around. The bases were ultimately dismantled and no nuclear war was ever had. However, this became as close as the United States or anyone has ever come to a full-blown nuclear confrontation. Some pretty intense times over the course of 14 days. By the 1970s, the nuclear arms race had reached the point where both the US and the Soviet Union decided that something had to be done to stop the spiraling cost and effort of a nuclear arms race. This led to what was called detente, which literally means thaw. In this case, it refers to an easing of tension between the US and the Soviet Union. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was eventually pushed out of power in favor of Leonid Brezhnev, a hardliner with the military but still willing to deal with 3 different US presidents during this time: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, shown here. During this time, the two countries began the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, the idea of which was to limit the buildup of nuclear weapons. At first, these agreements only limited the amount of increase. Didn't mean numbers were going down, it just meant they weren't going up as fast. Eventually, by the 1980s, treaties that actually started reducing the number of weapons finally began to happen. By the 1980s, Brezhnev was out, Mikhail Gorbachev was in. Ronald Reagan had been elected president in 1980 also, in large part on a program of increasing defense spending as well as tough talk against the Soviet Union and the Cold War. The 80s saw both sides increase defense spending dramatically, including what Reagan called the Strategic Defense Initiative. This idea was for space-based missile defense system in which satellites, lasers, and, believe it or not, mirrors were going to be used to try to shoot down missiles while they were in space before they re-entered the atmosphere. No wonder it was called Star Wars by some. The SDI never really came to pass, but you never know. As we said, Reagan often talked tough with the Soviet Union, referring to it as the evil empire. And during a famous speech in 1988 in West Berlin, he urged Gorbachev to tear down the wall. This played really well with the base at home, and with Gorbachev's economy in a tailspin, he really didn't have a lot of choices as to what he could do. He tried a reform policy called glasnost, or openness. He actually tried to ease up some of the restrictions of the totalitarian Soviet state, in hopes that it would head off economic disaster and revolution. Unfortunately, it didn't work for him. Because Russia's economy couldn't build itself back up and maintain the nuclear arms race, and because nationalist movements within the Soviet Union, remember, it's not just the Russians, it's all kinds of other nationalities as part of the Soviet Union as well. Ultimately, by 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse. This made countries like Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and so forth independent states, with all the joys and potential problems that encounters. Elsewhere in Europe, the countries that had been supported in communism by the Soviet Union were finding their own way. Starting in Poland. Ironically, it was a labor movement, a workers' campaign that led to the downfall of a system in Poland that was supposed to be benefiting the workers. Lech Walesa, shown here in the upper left-hand corner, was an electrician in the shipyards of Gdansk, Poland, on the northern coast. Walesa became the leader of the Solidarity Labor Union. And not only did Solidarity succeed in bucking the communist trend, but ultimately, after strikes, organizing their own press, and forming a political party, they captured 99 of the 100 seats they were eligible for in the first free elections held in Poland in decades. That in June of 1989. As we know, objects in motion tend to stay in motion. And when Poland collapsed, the communist government of Poland collapsed, other countries were going to follow. Same year that Valenza got elected to office, November 1989. The Berlin Wall finally came down. The East German government decided to resign en masse, which effectively created one government in Germany. At various checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, as you see in these pictures here, citizens from both sides gathered and literally, with hammers, chisels, tools, and bare hands, systematically broke down the gates and the walls and began to exchange across the border. When the wall opens up, who went where? Did the Easterners move west or did the Westerners move east? I think you can figure that one out. Most of the traffic went from east to west, looking for democracy. Ultimately, the final result of the fall of the wall became the reuniting of East and West Germany. Today, Germany is one of Europe's strongest powers, economically and politically. But for a long time during the Cold War, it had been the flashpoint of a lot of conflict, and a clear example of the difference between Western democracy and Eastern Bloc communism. Other movements within Europe. Czechoslovakia. You may remember that from the World War II unit. You may notice on this map that Czechoslovakia has now become two countries. That's the result of what happened in November of 1989, when a playwright named Václav Havel staged what became known as the Velvet Revolution, for two reasons. One, it tended to be a non-violent protest and a non-violent revolution, and two, Havel, who was a playwright and a lover of the arts, was also a huge fan of the American underground band, the Velvet Underground. As we said, it got the name in part because of its non-violent nature. And within the space of 2 days, Havel and his people were able to organize almost 500,000 marchers, which ultimately led to the first free elections in 41 years, ultimately leading to the Czechs and the Slovaks, two different nations in terms of culture and language, splitting up. As John Green put it, the greatest example of amicable divorce in political history. Not so amicable in Romania, where the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu had ordered troops to put down a student-led rebellion, similar to what happened in Kent State in 1970. The difference here is that the army ultimately turns against Ceausescu and doesn't work for him. He's arrested, he's put on trial on national TV, and almost immediately executed also on national television. Pretty freaky scene, but you can see here where force in this case truly equals mass times acceleration, and events quickly spiraled out of control for communism within Eastern Europe. And that's where we ultimately stand today. The Warsaw Pact by 1991 is broken up. Most of the states, as you see here in the dark green, have become independent, although Ukraine has had its issues with Russia recently, as we well know. And some Eastern European nations have even applied to join NATO. That's the Cold War, one of history's greatest rivalries, coming to a pretty crashing end in the late 80s and early 90s. We'll see you soon.